It's the first full week of February. That means it's Beanpot season. A great Beanpot Monday this week, setting up quite a Duncan Beanpot Championship game between BU and Northeastern. We'll dive into that and a whole lot more across Hockey East as things are heating up in the playoff race on both the men's and women's side. That's all next on This Week in Hockey East. Hey, everybody. Glad you're with us once again with Eric Galante. I'm Tyler Murray. And Eric, I'm throwing it right to you. You were at the Garden for game one and the first two games of the Beanpot. It's just a reminder of how great the Duncan Beanpot really is, and I cannot wait to hear your takeaways. What'd you see there?
Yeah, it was great atmosphere once again, packed house for both games, and really, really special stuff, and why this tournament is so special. We're going to get a very similar final to what we've had quite a bit through the years with BU taking on Northeastern. Boy, Northeastern, another come-from-behind effort in the third period, kind of like that main game, a little bit different, obviously, but you know, a couple things that stood out for Northeastern. It was a long time in between goals. They got off to a really good start. Alex Campbell getting on the board. That was at 7:08 of the first period. They didn't score again till 10:43 of the third when their captain, Justin Ritzkovian, got them on the board. Harvard scoring twice in the interim. Cam Whitehead had to defend a penalty shot in there. So long power plays for Harvard. So it was kind of a while there in between Northeastern goals. I thought there were some moments. I was actually pretty impressed with Harvard. I thought there were some moments where that game was there for the taking, but Northeastern dig deep once again. Jerry Keefe after the game just couldn't talk enough about his captain, Justin Ritzkovian, said he kind of felt like he paced things. He played extremely well, and Northeastern kind of rode him in that third period before Gunnar Wolf-Fontaine eventually scores the overtime game-winning goal. What was interesting was, what did we tell you in our preview? Power play for these two teams, right? Harvard's top 5 in the country, and Northeastern's been top 15 in the country, and maybe been top 2 in the country the last 2 or 3 weeks. Neither team scored a power play goal, and Northeastern was able to generate chances 5-on-5. They had 15 shots in the first period. They had 15 shots in the third period. I think that's a real positive for Northeastern. Jerry Keefe has said, why has their defense been so good the last couple of weeks on this winning streak? Because they've held the puck more on the offensive end. They haven't had to defend quite as much. So that really stood out for Northeastern. And they have their swagger. Jerry Keefe likes using that word. They have a swagger in the room, but now they've had the success to match up with that swagger. And I think that's really important for them. They're a tough team this time of year, and they're doing it once again. And by the way, if they can get through this weekend and then have success against BU, that's a quality win against a really good team at a neutral site, who, by the way, they've already beaten this year. Northeastern starts knocking on the pairwise door there pretty close. They're in the top 20 right now, so that's something to watch for Northeastern. Then let's talk about game two. And the biggest moment of game two is the first period. And BU comes out and really played well in the first period. I thought that Jay Pandolfo did a really good job of using the fact that BU was the home team and had the last change to move Macklin Celebrini around to get him away from the Cutter Gauthier line that did have some success defending him in the 2-game series 10 days ago. So Celebrini was on the ice against the Gabe Perreault, Will Smith, and Ryan Leonard line a little bit. He was out there against the third line a little bit. Now, obviously, once was on the power play, but he gets that shot and he's just able to put it away. So it doesn't really matter who he's against. But BC actually did a pretty good job shutting him down after that first period. He only had 3 shot attempts after the first period, but BU did enough in that first. They had 19 shots in that first on goal. They did such a good job coming out. And Tyler, that was kind of the difference in the game, because you could argue, I don't know if outplayed is the right word, but certainly out-attempted more of the flow in the offensive zone for Boston College after the first period. Some numbers for you. After the first, BC actually outshot BU 24-11. They out-attempted BU 61-22 after the first period. BC had 86 attempts to the game. That's their second most of the season. So this offensive power in Boston College, it was there. And credit to the Eagles for coming back in that third period down 4-1. Boy, it felt like if that game was 5 minutes longer, maybe there's a different result the way BC was coming in the third, but credit to BU for hanging on. So I think BC feels a little bit better about things because they did come back and you can pull some momentum out of that. But for BU, the way they took advantage of a couple of Boston College mistakes in their defensive end, first it was Luke Tuck and then it was Green scoring to make it, the third goal and then eventually the fourth goal. and that was enough for the difference. It felt like BC was the team that was taking advantage of those opportunities back 10 days ago in that series. It was BU who took advantage of those opportunities on Monday night. And then as a final point, when you hear 61 shot attempts, but only 24 on goal, the block numbers were off the charts for Boston University. And Tyler, you've mentioned this on our show, that BU quietly has been one of the best teams in terms of blocking shots. But how about 30 of them in that semifinal game to get to the championship? That really stands out. And it's a good lead in for BU, who will be in one of our games of the week this week when they take on Merrimack on Friday.
Yeah, it felt like they needed every one of those block shots, Eric. Actually, the most for BU in a single game since they blocked 51 in the 2017 Fargo Regional. That was the double overtime win over North Dakota. A Keller to McAvoy for the win. Cade Weber had 6 blocks. He's at 3.5 per game now to lead the nation. And it feels like this is what it takes to beat Boston College. I mean, I was so impressed with BC's late game fight. After that first period, it kind of felt like, well, maybe it's not their night. The giveaways, the penalties. But just when you think you're safe, here comes a big wave. You're hanging on for dear life if you're a Terrier fan. And you're absolutely right. The mistakes that BC made in their own end, they happen for every team. But like we saw for BU against BC, your arch rival is probably the best team in the country at taking advantage of it. But yes, BU against Merrimack, this is interesting because it's just one game, Friday night at Agganis Arena on Nesson. And for BU, I've been impressed with how they've done in these take care of business type games leading into big matchups. And again, they're leading into the Beanpot Championship on Monday. They swept Vermont a couple of weeks ago before that big number 1 versus number 2 home and home with BC. Then they went up 4-0 on UNH and won 6-3 just 3 days before the Beanpot. And now they have to focus on this game against Merrimack just 3 days before they take on Northeastern yet again in the championship game. And you mentioned Macklin Celebrini for good reason. He came back with a vengeance after being held to just 1 point in that weekend against BC. So 2 points in each of his last 3 games. Now tied for the nation lead with 21 goals. And maybe no coincidence that now he's skated with his old USHL teammate Jack Harvey from the Chicago Steel the last 2 games. Harvey had a couple of assists against Northeastern. He's one of their 14 NHL draft picks. There doesn't not every night playing time for Harvey, but it feels like he's earned it now as he's been on that top line the last couple of games. And the first goal is going to mean a lot, as it always seems to against BU. They are 11-0-0 when leading after 1 period. That was obviously tested against the Eagles on Monday, but they were still able to hang on. Now, for Merrimack, unfortunately, the story has been the health. They are missing 7 players due to injury last weekend. They could only dress 11 forwards. So it's a bit of a skid right now. But Scott Borick's group, they overcame a similar drought last year. Yeah, you go back to that miracle run or just a dream run they had. They certainly earned it. It wasn't a fluke. Last year, they dropped 5 out of 6 from January 20th through February 5th, same kind of time of the year. Then they won 7 in a row on their way to the Hockey East title game against BU, and they'll face off again for the 3rd time this year since then. They're doing all the gritty things you'd expect from this kind of team. They blocked 20 shots on Saturday, even though they were so shorthanded. Matt Capone continues to be a star. He's averaging over a point per game. But a breakout performer this year, Ty Deneau, is having an insane second half to his freshman year. 8 goals in his last 11 games. He had just 3 goals through the first 15. So a real second half standout, Ty Deneau. We'll see if he can generate some offense at Agganis Arena on Friday.
Yeah, that's going to be a really interesting game. We have a few big games on Nesson this week. We'll talk more about that in a second. But the biggest game on the women's side, Tyler, is Friday night. We've talked a lot about these 2 teams, but they are matched up on Friday, so we have to at least mention them again. First place UConn, 3rd place Northeastern. Now, what is the thing we've said about these 2 teams all year? Defense, defense, defense. And winning, I guess you could throw in winning, right? UConn hasn't lost since January 6th. Northeastern's only lost once since Thanksgiving. Now, we mentioned the defensive side. This Northeastern team, in 11 games between November 25th and January 26th, so it's basically 2 months, right? They did not give up 3 goals in any game. Now, suddenly, they've given up 3 goals, at least, in 3 games in a row. They have won, 3 out of 4. They've won all 4 of those games. You look at the last 3 specifically, they've given up 3 goals, 2 goals, and 3 goals. These are not crazy numbers, but they're higher than Northeastern's given up. But they're still winning them, and that's the big thing. Northeastern has now scored on the offensive end at least 3 and 4 straight games. So slowly, slightly, the offense is starting to come. It felt like it would, right, Tyler? I mean, we've talked about it a lot, but it's starting to come now for Northeastern. And how does that change the calculus in what was 2 low-scoring games the last time these two teams met? It was 3-0 and 1-0 in favor of UConn. Neither team had more than 23 shots in either of those 2 games. So how does that change now that Northeastern's offense is coming along a little bit and they're winning slightly, albeit more, high-scoring games in the last few weeks?
I'm looking at a series on the men's side. It's a rivalry in a lot of different sports. UMass and UConn, home and home. Friday in Stores, ESPN Plus. Saturday in Amherst on NESN. So you get a small rink size on Friday and a bigger ice sheet on Saturday. So interesting conditions there for both teams to adapt to. UMass, they just play tight games. We've talked about this a little bit, specifically against Merrimack this year, but it's been against everybody. 12 of UMass's last 14 games have been 1-goal games or ties. It includes last weekend's 3-2 win at Merrimack and the 1-0 loss at home against Maine, which is still a tough one to wrap your head around. Maine's the number 7 team in the country for a reason, but there were long stretches in that game where it really felt like UMass was about to not just tie the game, but break ahead. They actually had a goal called back. Michael Cameron put one in off of a rebound, but a few moments earlier, UMass was offside, so they reviewed it, they called it back. But if you focus on the third period, when UMass was really putting the pressure on, they only gave up 2 shots on goal in that period against Maine's really impressive offense. The Blackbirds got 20 shots across the first 2 periods in that game. It speaks to a larger trend about the Minutemen. They're outscoring opponents by double in the third this year, 36-18. When they're tied after 2, UMass is 4-1. When they're losing after 2, it's a pretty respectable 4-6-2 record. They'll come back on you, and that came into play the last time they played UConn back on January 5th. They were down 2-1 heading into the third, scored twice, and took a 3-2 lead with 2 minutes left until Hudson Shandor tied the game on the power play. UConn wins in a shootout. Player to watch, it's often this guy, but Ryan Ufko, he's been making some headlines with how Greg Carvel praised him after a recent win against Merrimack. He said he's up there, with the exception of Cale Makar, as the very best player or players he's coached during his time at UMass. So you think of the names that are up there now with Ufko: Bobby Trevino, John Leonard, Mario Ferraro, Mitchell Chafee, Mark Del Gaizo, Zach Jones. This is the kind of rarefied air Ufko has been playing himself into. So he's always been a fun blue liner to watch. UConn, they're fun to watch too, because consistency is tough to find, but you could argue they're playing some of their best hockey over the last month, and it's all coming against nationally ranked competition. You had your eye on this one, Eric. You almost called it. They gave Quinnipiac a real scare in Connecticut ice. They led that game 3-1 at the midway point, but the last 3 goals of the game belonged to Quinnipiac. So the 3 separate weekends I want to highlight. This is a little mind-blowing because they've gone almost exactly the same way. 3 separate weekends against top 20 teams in Hockey East: Maine, UNH, and Providence. Game 1 of the series, they allow 5 goals, and they lose that game. The next night, they score 2 goals, and that's enough to win. Most recently, a 2-1 win over Providence, outshot 43-19, but Ethan Hyder had a huge day in net, at least 13 saves in every period in that game. So the last 4 wins for UConn and Hockey East: 2-0, 2-0, 2-1, and 2-1. Yes, you want more goal scoring, but against UMass, a team that they're playing tight games lately, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world to have experience grinding out wins and knowing how to handle a pretty good offense in UMass and maybe some being able to limit them somehow. Now, the offense for UConn, keep an eye on Chase Bradley. He had the game-winning goal against Providence. He scored a goal in 3 of his last 5 games. Plus, he had 4 assists against Sacred Heart in Connecticut ice. He's the kind of talent that can really carry a team when he's going right. So we'll see if that continues for Chase Bradley this weekend.
Boy, how many times has it felt like we've said about UConn? It's right there. It's right there. And, you know, as you mentioned, to their credit, they are winning some of these games, but they've obviously put themselves in a little bit of a hole that it feels like you need to sweep some of these series to really move up pairwise purposes. But they're right in it in the hockey standings. And the standings is where we're going to turn as we take a few short shifts with you. Brought to you, as always, by the Shift Group, helping elite athletes and veterans become elite sales professionals. Tyler, let's start on the women's side of things. And we figured with this week, we're getting close to the end of the season. We're in the home stretch in the last month as we turn to February. Where are we? And especially, we're going to focus on that cut line between the opening round and the quarterfinals, and who's going to play in that opening round and who is going to be able to sit and watch and not have to worry about things until the weekend. On the women's side, you're talking about a couple of different teams. Remember, you're talking about BU, you're talking about Vermont, you're talking about Merrimack, who are all in that 6, 7, 8 range. Remember, the top 6 are safe on the women's side. The top 5 are safe on the men's side. So BU was a really big win last weekend on Saturday against BC to get over the hump, to break that 4-game losing streak. BU is now a couple of points clear of Vermont. Now, the good news for Vermont is they do have a game in hand against BU. And BU will play 1 game against Maine on Friday. Vermont will kind of make up that game in hand this weekend. The bad news for Vermont is the schedule is really challenging coming up. They are at Boston College and at Providence this weekend. Providence is playing as well as any team in the league. BC is number 2 right now in the hockey standings. Then they have BU at home in what might decide this thing. And then that's followed by UConn, followed by 2 games at Northeastern to end the season. So they play the top of hockey. So we're going to really see where this Vermont team is. It's a big split between home and road for Vermont. They're 2-9-1 on the road versus 9-6-1 at home. And then you have Merrimack and Maine, who are in the 8-9 spot right now. And a Merrimack team, how great would it be if they could find a way to get home ice in that opening round, if not even move up potentially? Merrimack's had success in the opening round the last couple of years. Merrimack has a home and home with New Hampshire this weekend. New Hampshire has kind of been towing the line between the 3, the 4, the 5 spot all season long. They lost a couple of really tight games to Northeastern, last weekend. Merrimack has 2 points clear of Maine with the game in hand, so they really have a chance to play for home ice, and this weekend could go a long way towards that. So there's a lot of interesting possibilities right around that cut line for the opening round on the women's side.
And for the men, I'm looking at a couple of swing points in the bracket as well. Top 5 seeds get a bye to the quarterfinals. So top 4 get a home game in that round. But that 5 spot very much up for grabs between UConn and UMass. UConn is just a point up on Massachusetts. They have 3 games in hand, UMass does. So they just need an okay weekend to pass them and feel like they're in pretty good shape. So certainly keep an eye on that one. But now, if you don't get a first round bye, you're at least gunning for a top 8 seed, so you can host one of those first-round playoff games. And the 8 seed's a little tenuous. Northeastern has it right now, and it sure feels like they've figured things out. So they have to feel good about their chance to move up even further. But the team right behind them is just 4 points back, and it's Vermont, who has 3 games in hand on Northeastern. We'll look at the schedule for the Catamounts. Their next 4 games are against the 2 teams below them in the standings. So Northeastern has a bye. They'll be keeping an eye, I'm sure, on Vermont against UMass Lowell. Now, Vermont's coming on the road to the Tsongas Center. We know how tough it is to win there. But if Vermont can find a way to pick up some points in that 2-game series, then they're looking at maybe the possibility of hosting a game in the first round at the Gut, where they do have a winning record this year. So a bit of an opportunity for Vermont. It'll be interesting to keep an eye on that. It was Greg Carville who says usually he doesn't keep a close eye on standings until right around now. So coaches are more aware than ever. We know fans certainly are. Every single game, every single point going to be huge. When you start your playoff run, where you start your playoff run, we'll be diving more into that next week, and we'll crown a Duncan Beanpot champion as well on This Week in Hockey East. We'll talk to you then.